Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this Toxics webinar on existing formulations of pesticides, more toxic than the active ingredients. This webinar is brought to you by MDPI, which is a pioneer in scholarly open access publishing. MDPI has supported the academic community since 1996. Based in Basel, Switzerland, MDPI has the mission to foster open scientific exchange in all forms and across all disciplines. Our 422 diverse and open access journals, including 413 peer-reviewed journals and 4 conference journals, are supported by more than 115,000 academic experts who share our mission, values, and commitment to providing high-quality service to our authors. More specifically, this webinar is hosted by our journal Toxics, which is an international peer-reviewed journal, open access journal on all aspects of toxic chemicals and materials, published monthly by MDPI. If you would be interested to read a little bit more, and if you also would be interested to submit a manuscript on the topic of this seminar, Toxics has currently opened a special issue with the name Pesticides in Formulations, Toxicological and Regulatory Assessment, New Developments, which is with a deadline at the end of June, and this special issue is guest edited by our chair, Professor Seralini. A little bit to the organization of this webinar. So before I give away to the chair of this session of this webinar, there are 4 talks today. The first one will be delivered by Professor Seralini, and the 3 rest will be given by Dr. Mesnaz, Dr. Bacon, and Professor Vandelak. We will do all the talks in sequence, so there will be no discussions once the talks is done. We will do one Q&A session after the very last talk. And afterwards, Professor Seralini will also give the closing remarks. So to our chair, Professor Gilles-Éric Seralini from the Institute of Biology, University of Caen, Normandy, and the Network on Risk, Quality and Sustainable Environment from France. Professor Seralini is an international researcher working on the effect of pollutants on health, especially the GMOs and pesticides. He has discovered major hidden toxicities for these products, and he's also was fighting in several court processes, and he defended his views. Professor Seralini, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen, and feel free to start with your presentation.
Thank you very much for this very nice presentation. And I would like to introduce you on the Monsanto papers that we have discovered, and that in fact were a lot against our work. That has been translated in several languages, including American, and by Robert Kennedy, who is now running for presidency in America. It was introduced, and also in Spanish and in German, and it was, of course, originally written in French. So you can have many details on my website or on Secret Toxics websites. So this is a book in English, so it does exist for those who want to share. This webinar is registered, so we are going to begin. First of all, we discovered since 2005 the difference between glyphosate, the molecule, and Roundup on human cells. This is the original part of the work on all kinds of human cells, more than 10 cell lineages, and also fresh human cells from fetuses or babies. And we were really astonished to see that herbicide, as it exists, like Roundup, but we tested many formulations, appear to be at least 1,000 times more toxic than glyphosate alone. And since that time, Monsanto, who is the owner of glyphosate, was after me and cited me 56,000 times in a secret manner. We learned that in 2016, so a long time after. And they tried to destroy my reputation and work and body. Even I explained that in the book. We learned that in the Monsanto papers because they were obliged to publish by court the Monsanto papers. The American court, you know, there were 100,000 patients that were complaining to have cancers, and they cited the ER report saying who cited itself many of our papers, 7 of our papers, and they have hidden the facts, Monsanto, about the toxicity of Roundup, and this is why they were, in fact,
Professor Saloni, just a short remark. Do you have some slides? Would you mind to share your screen, maybe?
So I have seen the first slide and the second slide about the Monsanto papers book, and I was explaining that. So people won against Monsanto, who was now sold to Bayer, the big multinational international company, and because they made a fraud, because they didn't say to court all the truth about the hidden toxicity of Roundup, and this was very important because they have lost 10 billions. At the same time, the European authorities have given some help to them, so so they didn't lose too much. However, we published the difference between glyphosate and Roundup, and we didn't know why at this time, but originally in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is a good journal, and we actually said that the problem was in Roundup, but we didn't know why. And what we did afterwards is to find what was the problem. We have first confirmed many times the work, and also explain it is finally an oxidative stress in the cells and in the bodies, which is due to formulants alone. So the formulants is a hidden, non-declared part of the pesticide, of any pesticide, because any pesticide is not like a supposed declared active molecule in water, but it is mixed with other things, the so-called adjuvant, and Dr. Robin Ménage will explain us what it is. But we have shown that it was due to heavy metals. Here you have the heavy metals that are killing alone the plant at the level, this is very important, which is in the pesticide. And also petroleum residues, which are in fact HPH, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that we characterized recently in Toxics in November 2022, and that are very well characterized now, but which are not declared in the formulation of glyphosate-based pesticides. So many other pesticides, such as neonicotinoids, containing also these formulants of petroleum, and this can change dramatically the ADI, so the acceptable daily intake of pesticide. So the toxicity is increased by at least 1,000, and this is not taken into account today by regulatory agencies. They admitted at Secret Toxics, we had a webinar with all the staff of EFSA, including the director and the direction of toxicology, and European deputies who shared the session. And in fact, they admitted they never, and it was never to their knowledge, the formulation was tested. But this is what is put in nature. That means a whole pesticide in formulation. It's a mixture of the so-called declared active principle and the adjuvants, which do contain 1 to 3% to these petroleum residues, and who can make the job alone. So we were aggressed scientifically by this explosion of 2012 in the media, and I was a lot attacked. And the director of Monsanto Toxicology, who is now director of Bayer Toxicology, Donna Farmer, she admitted in court, and this is registered on video on YouTube, that Roundup was never tested, in fact. So she said, I suppose that glyphosate is not toxic on the long term, but we never tested Roundup. So this is why the big company was fined up to, well, Bayer signed an agreement of 10 billion euros with all the patients. So what we published recently was the petroleum in pesticides. And this is the paper. And there is a need to change, because of that, the regulatory toxicology. This is why we organized this seminar, and this is why we would like to make a review, a collective review of all the problem with all the scientists who want to, because we need ideas to change the regulatory toxicology. Of course, we have some ideas, but they can be bettered with other participations. So each column is a pesticide, and we find different pH, even in different lots of the same pesticide with the same number of lots, we have different petroleum residues. So that means, and we have characterized that in other terms, that it's a garbage of petroleum. It is not a defined quantity of petroleum. And this is why it's not declared, because you cannot patent or declare garbage of things, but it amplifies the penetrability, the solubility of the active ingredient very much. And anyway, the active ingredient is, to prevent questions, is able to penetrate itself in the plant, in the human cells, in the all kingdom tissues. So we have identified where these residues of petroleum were coming from. They are coming from various parts of fractionating tower and our garbage. So they are intermediate parts between, for instance, diesel and fuel, or between, for planes. You have intermediate parts which are really not purified, which are waste for them, for fractionating towers. And this is, in fact, put in garbage, in containers to amplify the toxicity of pesticides, but also for washing detergents. Because if you put that together with soap on the street, for instance, you can wash all the roads this way very efficiently. But it is toxic, and this may explain why we found so many petroleum residues on baby jeans. We also found these petroleum residues in penguins all over the world, in Antarctica. So even people that have not used 1 gram of pesticide, and even species, animal species that have not used 1 gram of pesticide, they are contaminated all over the world by glyphosate and by these residues, including heavy metals that were in the original formulations of pesticides. So we have a big law problem. This is why it is also a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary problem, so that the class actions which allow to in fact collapse or to meet many people, you have 100,000 patients in the States, are not possible in other countries of Europe, for instance. And so this is why we had those 10 billions lost by Monsanto Bayer in the States, but only 1 patient for a ridiculous amount won in France, and no other in the world, to my knowledge. And we are working on that difference, that legal difference, but it is a long process. And not many scientists know this, because this is also a problem, because today scientists are more concentrated on the so-called active ingredient. So they are calculating with the ADI, the supposed toxicity of the ingredient, and there are many scientific papers about the toxicity of active ingredients, but not on the formulated. They often don't use, if you go to the material methods, they don't use the formulated pesticide, which is a way more toxic. So this explains also the threshold differences, not only between species, but between active ingredients and what I call formulation. That means the full pesticide. So we have already demonstrated that this was a problem on the microbiome, which is there, because it affects the gut microbiome. And we have demonstrated that these organic pollutants of PAH are in the food, especially in the non-organic food. The food which is not treated by pesticides has a lot less. We have published that. There is, in green, you have less polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon in the food, in the organic food, than in the non-organic products, especially cheese and sausages, which are full of these products because they do contain pesticides. So just a word to finish about solutions. We have, of course, legal solutions we can try to apply, but this will be long to oblige the companies. We need the coordination with politicians, and this is not easy. But we have found that scientifically, there is also a solution with gut microbiota and bacteria, especially with yeasts that is a small part of the microbiota, which is 100 times less than bacteria, which are 100 times less than bacteria, but which can help the detoxification and the micronutrition. So I will not enter this topic, which is a brand new topic, but I wrote a review to explain the human gut, so-called phangiome, which is in fact a good part, at least cellularly, a good part of the microbiome, but it is a very small 1%. They can even coordinate good bacteria. Okay, I'm finished. So thank you for your attention. And I would like to you to note the websites if you want. I have then a question for my collaborators and the people in that meeting. Have you any suggestion to help to change the regulatory toxicity? And also, I would like to say that we could write these suggestions all together in Toxics.
Thank you very much, Professor Seralini, for your lecture. Our next speaker is Dr. Robin Ménage. He's a scientist in molecular biology. His core expertise lies in the analysis of complex biological systems, particularly the gut microbiome. He is currently visiting researcher at the King's College in London, where he studies the effects of life science interventions or food pollutants. He is also occasionally uses his expertise as a toxicologist to provide expert consulting on the risk assessment of pesticides and act as an editor for scientific books or journals. His research resulted in the publication of over 100 scientific articles, and they were cited more than 7,000 times. And his findings were used to better regulate pesticides' health effects. So, Professor Dr. Ménage, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm Robin Ménage, and maybe what I can add to this presentation is that I was the PhD student of Professor Seralini, so we have been working together during a long time on this topic, and what I will present has been partially done with Dr. Seralini, and then also continued when I was working at King's College London. So I will talk about glyphosate, which is one model for all pesticides, and glyphosate is an interesting model because it is used pretty much everywhere on the planet, and in particular where the genetically modified crops which are made to tolerate Roundup applications are planted. So a lot in the US, a lot in South America, but also in Europe, even if we don't have this type of GMOs authorized, glyphosate is used a lot for desiccations before harvest, or also for cosmetic use, simply in some parks, not everywhere because it is more and more regulated, but this is still one of the major pesticides. So we have been wondering if the regulation of glyphosate is correct, but actually we should not just talk about glyphosate. Glyphosate is just the top of the pyramid. This is always mixed with co-formulants. Sometimes these molecules are also called formulants or also called adjuvants. So they are substances which are added to the glyphosate formulation so that glyphosate is stabilized and its penetration is increased. The penetration is made to be increased in the leaves, so glyphosate would kill the plant more efficiently. But these formulants also have some effects by themselves. They are toxic, and they would also increase the penetration of glyphosate on human cells. And if you are exposed to glyphosate on your skin, glyphosate will enter more your body because of the co-formulants. One big problem in the regulatory toxicology to study this substance is that most of these formulants are considered to be confidential business information. So if you want to study a pesticide, this is not easy because you generally look at what is on the label or what is disclosed on the material safety data sheets. And as you can see on this screen, in the case of the data sheet of Roundup Original, for instance, it is specified that, of course, it contains glyphosate, but these other ingredients, which are the co-formulants, they are considered as trade secrets. So it means that you can't really track these formulants or contaminants in the environment or in human body because you don't know what they are. So it means that it's very complicated. And when you look at the big picture about glyphosate carcinogenicity and this debate, there is really it is very polarized. And now we know that Roundup has never been tested actually for carcinogenicity, and this is what farmers use. So we are really distracting from the big picture when you look at glyphosate itself. And clearly the debate on glyphosate carcinogenicity would have been very different if Roundup, the full formulation, was tested from the start. So glyphosate is always regulated as a single ingredient, even if it's used in formulation. And this is mostly true for long-term effect. Roundup is never tested. And these co-formulants, even if they are toxic, they are not included in the calculation of safety threshold from like acceptable daily intake. So it means that a farmer who is exposed lifelong to glyphosate-based formulation is protected only from calculation done with glyphosate alone. We have been testing glyphosate and glyphosate formulations from a long time ago with Professor Seralini. And what I show now is part of the work we have been doing together. And we clearly showed that when you expose human cells to these formulations, the formulations, almost all of them are more toxic than glyphosate alone. And sometimes they are up to 1,000 times more toxic. So we have been really looking at what is the main toxic agent of these formulations. And in the test of 9 formulations and also their co-formulants, at least the ones that we could really source commercially, and the ones that we can also identify by mass spectrometry, because in this study, we didn't know the formulation composition for most of them. So we looked at composition through experiment like mass spectrometry. And we could see for the first time that the formulations and their toxicity was proportional to the concentration in some specific adjuvants. The name of this adjuvant or co-formulant, also you can call that this way, this was POEA, and this POEA, one of them was then banned in the EU. It was just replacing the problem by other co-formulants, because glyphosate is still used and sold with co-formulants which are more toxic than glyphosate. More recently, we were extending, and this is an article which has been published in Toxics in the special issue, which was managed by Professor Seralini. We looked at the toxicity of other pesticides, looking not just at glyphosate, but we compared also to major other herbicides, focusing on what is used in the UK in this case. And we found that in many cases, the toxicity of major herbicides was not due to the active ingredients, but mostly to co-formulants, which was included in this. So this is not a specific action of glyphosate, and this property of pesticide can be generalized. We looked also in 2014, when I was working with Professor Seralini, at insecticides and fungicides, and we also found that these contain very toxic compounds, which are in most cases unregulated and responsible for toxic effects. So some recommendation we have is to test always the formulations as a whole mixture, because if we don't know what's inside, we only have this possibility if we want to test them. And then we can also have safety factors which are added to the calculation of acceptable daily intake. And these safety factors will depend on the pesticide, because the difference in toxicity between formulations and active ingredient is not always the same. It's also depending on context. And so this is something which is very difficult to generalize, and there is a lot of work, and we really encourage regulators to take that and really explore this topic. What else can be done to improve these tests? We have been looking at different properties which are not well explored in the pesticide toxicology, like the endocrinology. So many pesticides are endocrine disruptors, and so they can disturb hormonal system and can be a source of chronic disease. And there are also more difficult things to address, like doing the tests with a full design that examines the full lifespan of the animal, including a prenatal period and including new endpoints like the gut microbiome. For this, I want to show you also what has been done recently and what is the most up-to-date progress. And perhaps this study is the most comprehensive which has been ever done on glyphosate and Roundup formulations. And this is ongoing at the Ramazzini Institute, which is an institute in Italy. They are specialists in carcinogenicity. They have tested dozens of substances in the last 20, 40 years. And they are really specialists. They know, they have guidelines for evaluating the carcinogenicity of pesticides, which make their test more precise than the one done by regulators. So at the moment, they have been doing a large study of testing the effects of glyphosate on different endpoints that you can see on this slide, but not just glyphosate. I'm part of this consortium, and so we looked at also the effects of Ranger Pro, one of the major formulation of glyphosate which is used in the US, and also a formulation in Europe, which is Roundup BioFlow, the formulation which is supposed to be representative of all formulation in Europe. I can disclose you some first results that we've been publishing. We looked at the gut microbiome, and in this study, it's joining what was saying Professor Seralini, because we didn't look just at the bacterial composition, because this is generally what you look at. When you look at gut microbiome, generally, even if it's made of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and many organisms, we tend to focus always on bacteria. And many studies have been done to look at the effects of glyphosate on bacteria in the gut, but not many have looked at bacteria and fungus. This is what we did, and we found something very interesting because there was really large effect of glyphosate, but even more of the formulation. That's what you can see on this slide. All the little symbols means that there are some changes in the bacteria, which have their name below, and the different treatments are what you can see on the right side. And what we found was really interesting because most of the bacteria, they were killed by glyphosate. Some were resistant, of course, but there was a decreased resilience of the gut microbiome at the bacterial level. And it means that fungi, which can be opportunistic and grow in this condition, they could proliferate. And we found that glyphosate and even more Roundup, it reduced what we call the colonization resistance. So fungi can proliferate in the gut, and it allowed opportunistic fungi to grow in the gut. We don't know exactly if this is something which would be valid for humans. The gut microbiome is complex. Some fungi, they can be just passengers and just go through the gut. Some are important residents in the gut. So there is a need for more studies at this level. Just a quick summary to wrap up what I said. So I want really to insist that we should always think about these co-formulants and the whole formulation when we think about the pesticides. Because if we think and talk only about the active ingredients, this is the tip of the iceberg. And when we look at these compounds, we should think at more things than just the toxicity studies, because these co-formulants, they have not been monitored in animal and human foodstuff, and we need to know where they are in the food chain. It's clear that based on this, the identity and toxicity of co-formulants should be disclosed, and they should be monitored by regulatory agencies. And their study should really be a focus when we think about association to disease. There's this debate about the role of glyphosate in non-Hodgkin lymphoma. This is still debated, but it's debated probably also because we only know one part of the picture. There is this debate on glyphosate, which has been going on since 40 years of commercialization. And I really believe that this debate would be very different if the formulated product would have been tested from the start, and if their ingredient would have been tested from the start, because This is confusing for everyone, and we looked at some point with Professor Seralini at the scientific literature, and we could see that other scientists, when they test glyphosate, sometimes they make mistakes. They say that they have tested glyphosate, but in fact it was a formulation. They make mistake about what's in the formulation. The names are not written well, and sometimes formulants, they are different from one country to another. So when you write a scientific paper about a pesticide, it's always important to have what formulation has been tested, the regulatory approval number, what are the ingredients if they are known, and also when you have been purchasing this formulation and with which country. And this is only by having this minimal level of information that we will be really able to move forward in the toxicology of pesticides. If you want to know more about this topic, there are some reviews I have been publishing with some colleagues recently, and also a book that I wrote with Johan Zahler about herbicides in general. There's a chapter on co-formulants and much more. We looked at the different aspects from the ecological level to agronomical level and toxicity. So this is really the Bible of herbicide toxicology, if I may say. And just as a short outro, I want to thank my colleagues, the colleagues from King's College, my supervisor at the time, and also colleagues from the various institutes who have been working with us. The Ramadini Institute, of course, doing all these studies, the Leiden Medical Centrum, who have been working with them for gut microbiome studies. We've been working also with the CHU of Limoges in France to make pesticide assessments in the urine of individuals exposed to pesticides. And also the Twins UK cohort at King's College London. We have been working on effects of pesticide in twins. So thank you for your attention. I hope that this presentation was instructive, and don't hesitate to reach me if you want to know more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Menash. I would like to also remind to our attendees that they can ask questions of our panelists. They can just write it in the Q&A chat box, which is at the bottom of their screen. Our next talk will be delivered by Dr. Marie-Hélène Bacon. She has a PhD in sociology and is a researcher and coordinator of the EcoHealth Research Collective and Pesticides Policies and Alternatives at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Her interdisciplinary expertise focuses on scientific assessment, regulatory and policy frameworks of emerging technologies such as biopharmaceuticals, genetic engineering and GMOs, chemical substances, and agri-food systems, as well as their related health, environmental, and socio-economic issues. Dr. Bacon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So most of the elements that Louise Van Lack and I will present today have been published last January in the journal Toxic in an article titled Poisoning Regulation, Research, Health, and the Environment, the glyphosate-based herbicide case in Canada. An article that we published with Marc-André Gagnon and Lise Parent. So today I will address the assessment of pesticides in Canada, and Louise will elaborate on the issue of transparency and its importance for reducing pesticide use and their impact. So despite speeches advocating a reduction in pesticides, their use has increased exponentially in the agricultural sector, especially in America and in Asia. And we're talking about a global increase of 81% in 31 years. A major share of this market, worth $61 billion in 2020, is held by the sales of glyphosate-based herbicides, of which Roundup is the best known. They are, in fact, the most widely used pesticides in the world, and in Canada as well, where in 2017 they accounted for 58% of pesticides used in the agricultural sector. Since 2007, they have ranked first among the 10 best-selling products in Canada, and they are used everywhere, really on GM crops such as corn, soybeans, and canola, as well as on berries, forest, railroad rights of ways, golf courses, and garden. And in Canada, it's allowed 25% more of GBH on these GM crops than on conventional ones. And even though there is a lot of independent scientific literature published on the harmful impact of pesticides, Canada is lagging far behind in terms of pesticides regulation. So out of 531 active pesticide ingredient banned in 168 countries, only 32 were banned in Canada. And on the 146 pesticides considered highly hazardous by the FAO, who joined meeting on pesticides management, only 25 are banned in Canada. And if you compare, there was 464 that were banned or not approved in the EU, and even Brazil has more banned pesticides than Canada. So why is that? So one of the answers lies in the Monsanto papers that were introduced earlier by Géléric Serralini. So it's those 10 million pages of declassified internal documents that Monsanto had been forced to hand over to the court during the American trials against these firms by the 125,000 victims of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, attributed to Roundup. And the Monsanto papers show the extent of Monsanto's behind-the-scenes strategies to promote their product and its safety. And this wide variety of tactics are including disrupting the peer review process of scientific articles, create false scientific and public controversies, revolving doors, or intimidation, attacks, and destruction of the reputation and work of scientists, journalists, and research centers. And these diverse tactics were used to reach Monsanto goals, which were first to control and impose the narrative on Roundup, GMO, and GBH. Second, to interfere with scientific assessment of pesticides, cultivate scientific doubt and confusion. And third, to influence and control the regulatory and political process. And one of their main achievements was to create a confusion between glyphosate and its formulated products, as it had been shown earlier, and to make everyone focus, including and especially the regulatory agencies, on glyphosate as the only declared active ingredient of GBH. But actually, they knew that Roundup was toxic. And here I've just put some quotes that are taken from the Monsanto papers that shows that from early on, Monsanto executives were aware of toxicity concerns and that they did then everything they could to hide it using those management strategies, which have been working especially well in North America. So in Canada, it's the Pest Management Regulatory Agency of Health Canada that is responsible for pesticides evaluation and regulation. The PMRA has been working for many years now closely with its counterparts in the United States, the EPA, and has aligned its policies, its pesticides evaluation and regulation with the American ones. And because the evaluation of pesticide is risk-based in Canada, meaning that the main objective is to prevent unacceptable risk, the precautionary principle does not exist and does not even have any legal weight, contrary to Europe, where it can play a role in legal in trials. So, as it was mentioned before, in Canada as well, the declared active ingredient by the companies is the only focus of the regulatory assessment and established norms, for instance, in food and water. and the PMRA does not assess the commercial product. So, for instance, Roundup Weather, as an example, Roundup Weather Max, which is widely used in the province of Quebec, contains formulants such as arsenic and lead, which are known to be toxic and endocrine disruptors. But when assessing environmental and health impact of pesticides, the PMRA ignores surfactants, heavy metals, petroleum, and other contaminants, even though these mixtures of compounds can be highly toxic, as we've seen earlier. Another example would be the surfactant POEAs, which were banned in Europe in 2016 due to their toxicity. The PMRA's glyphosate re-evaluation in 2017 exceptionally assessed the toxicity of POEA, only to conclude that no human health risk of concern were identified, so they are authorized in Canada. So here, the scientific assessments and regulation do not take into account, for instance, genotoxicity, neurotoxicity, or endocrine disruptors effects of formulation, or the cumulative or synergetic effects of pesticides. They do not take also into consideration new discoveries of the health and environmental impacts of pesticides and their long-term toxicities in all ecosystems. The 2015 assessments of glyphosate in Canada showed that the evaluation was essentially based on 32 pages of reference to studies and information provided by the agrochemical industry, which are confidential, and that it ignored independent scientific literature on the harmful effects of GBH formulation. For example, the section concerning the assessment of toxicological risk was based on 118 very obsolete industry reference, with 81% produced between 1972 and 1996. A PubMed search of scientific article on glyphosate done in 2017 showed that the majority, 68% of the articles were published from 2007 to 2017. And yet, the toxicological hazard section of the PMRA document only include 12 references from 2007 to 2012. The PMRA wrote in its final decision that it considered additional published scientific literature. But first, it should be known that this literature contains many ghost-written scientific articles sponsored by the agrochemical industry. And numerous studies demonstrating the harmful impact of GBH and glyphosate were also dismissed, including the one from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which conclude after a thorough review of independent scientific studies in 2015 on both glyphosate and GBH that they are carcinogenic and genotoxic. It also found an association between non-Hodgkin lymphoma and exposure to glyphosate. So the PMRA excluded this study on the ground that it was solely based on independent scientific literature and excluded studies and data produced by the firms. So this is the kind of assessment done by the PMRA that conducted to the renewal of GBH in 2017 for another 15 years or until 2032. The PMRA is constantly repeating that its pesticides evaluation and decision-making processes are science-based, but in reality, the scientific assessment of pesticides in Canada is like a black box. Not only is it based on dated secret industry studies, but there is no access to the data analyzed. In Canada, agrochemical firms can decide which information is considered confidential business information, CBI, and therefore may not be disclosed publicly, even through the Access to Information Act. So the identity and concentration of formulants and contaminants in the pesticides are regarded as CBI. and even basic information on pesticides, such as accurate sales numbers, are not publicly disclosed. Of course, it's possible to ask to gain access to the reading room at the PMRA's national head office to look at the scientific test data sent by manufacturers that are not considered CB-high. However, to do so, a person must first send an application form to identify the data to be inspected, and an affidavit made under oath or a statutory declaration under the Canada Evidence Act stating the purpose of the visit. Once the request is approved, an appointment scheduled and the inquirer's identity proven, entrance into the reading room is permitted with only a pencil and a paper in hand, and only if the inquirer has previously signed an agreement to let Health Canada photocopy handwritten notes after exiting the room, as cell phones, laptops, and digital cameras must be left outside the room to prevent copying data. The room is monitored during the visits and contain only a computer with disabled ports and no access to the internet or internal networks. And this is all. The PMRA claims it facilitates transparency on pesticides evaluation in Canada. Yet, a real transparency is essential to protect population health, the environment, and the biodiversity in the context where there is in Canada really an important scientific, regulatory, and political captures of federal agencies by agrochemical industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bacon. Let's move to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Professor Louis Van der Lack. Professor Van der Lack is from Department of Sociology and in the Institute of Environmental Sciences at the University of Quebec in Montreal. As a co-director of the first Francophone web and open science academic journal in the environmental sciences, Vertigo, she is the founder and the director of CREPA, a research team on eco-health, pesticides policies, and alternatives funded by the Quebec Research Fund FQRSC. The interdisciplinary expertise of Professor Van der Lack on the socioeconomic analysis of socio-technical transformation of the living, focus on the public scientific assessment and regulation, and the ecological and sanitary impacts aggravating the risk of ecocide and anthropocide. Professor Van der Lack, the floor is yours.
Okay, so existing formulation of pesticides more toxic than active ingredients. I would like to enlarge a little bit the notion of toxicity here with a metaphor in a certain way. It's the way to do things by some sociologists. So existing formulation of pesticide more toxic than their active ingredient. Is this title appropriate to analyze GBH in Canada? Yes, it's a key to understand the structural increase of glyphosate in the world and in Canada. An increase based on the following trends: relying on secrecy and the concealment of data, especially in Canada, ignoring personal and global environmental health effects, neglecting the impact of the industrial food system on health and on biodiversity and planetary boundaries, performing partial and biased assessment of the pesticide, as Marie-Hélène showed just before me, and all the work of Gilles-Éric Siralini and also the work of Robin Ménage show that perfectly well. Contributing to agribusiness concentration and reducing agriculture to a growth perspective and limiting regulation to suit agribusiness interests. I will pass quite rapidly because it's supposed to be 10 minutes. So leading pesticide worldwide, more than one-fold in spraying since 1974. Canada, it's over 50% of pesticide. In a certain year, it's up to 58. and as it was said, coformulants up to 1,000 times more toxic than declared active ingredient. In Quebec, even everybody is speaking about reducing pesticide, and even we had 4 plans to reduce pesticide. In fact, we saw an increase of near 5 times fold increase since 92. In United States, where we have these kind of maps since years, we show quite well how the progression is important, and it has impact on the soil and impact also on the water. There's a lot of study we're publishing these days on that. When I was saying relying on secrecy, sorry. In fact, Canada hides herbicide sales. And we found that because they are saying in one column, it's more than 25,000 kilo of active ingredients. But in fact, how much more? And the how much more means that instead of a total of 3,000 3,100 kilo, it's 4,669 kilo, near 4,070 kilo. So it's they are hiding 57 increase in glyphosate, 169 in dicamba, and in 240, it's more than that, because we have an increase which is near 3 times more. So it's completely abnormal that the government is hiding the data. And there's a lot of ways to hide the data. We just analyze the data produced by Quebec state, and it's more or less the same. They're not able to produce real and complete data. And it's quite a pity that we have to have access to use the access law to information. It's important because it could have impact on health, especially, and on environment also. Here is just an analysis done by Carex, who works on cancer. And Quebec is home to near, in fact, half of the people exposed, the most exposed to glyphosate-based herbicide. You have these information here. So in Canada, Quebec is the most important place where we are exposed, and especially in the region where we had a research project in the Montérégie, near Montreal, because there's a lot of people who are living there, which is quite different than the prairies, for example, where you have large farms without a lot of people. So this can be important to have real data and complete data to be able to begin to analyze these questions, especially because non-Hodgkinian lymphoma case, Gilles just spoke about the people in the United States who have sued Bayer Monsanto, pretending that their lymphoma was associated with Roundup. And we know that the company has accept to have to pay near 11 billion to try to resolve 1,000 of the 1,025 cases. So it's a real issue, very important. And in Canada and in Quebec, these non-Hodgkin lymphoma cases have to be analyzed. we are not saying here that they are directly related to glyphosate-based herbicide, but there's enough data and enough studies which were done to have a real suspicion about that. When I was saying relying on secrecy and the concealment of data, one of the worst case is about Parkinson. We asked for information about 6 pesticides which are associated to Parkinson. The degenerative disease heavily impacts both affect individuals and their relatives. We know that, for example, mancozeb, which is still used largely in Canada and still in Quebec, which represent 4% of the sales, was classified in 2019 by the European Food Safety Authority as a reprotoxic and endocrine disrupting substance. Mancozeb is banned in the European Union since January 21. Health Canada refused to reveal complete sales data for these pesticides, which seriously undermines its public accountability. When we're speaking about health, we have to see all the aspects of health. And in the paper and in other paper, we present, for example, the fact that there's more than 100,000 people were affected by pesticide. They are contaminated by pesticide each year, which is a large number, and 11,000 are dying from it. In fact, it's a large story, all these health impact of pesticide, and especially what we call the pesticide, which are the most toxic. But one aspect that we don't speak a lot is the relation between, and here I just put some slides because if not, we have a 3 hours presentation. But we know that the intensive agriculture model of the actual food system is one of the major responsible for the increase of climate change, for the degradation of biodiversity. And at the end, it has impact on the planetary boundaries. Actually, planetary boundaries limits exceed for climate change, for biosphere integrity, for land use change, for biochemical flux, phosphorus and nitrogen, the last two one especially related to the actual model of food system. On the way to being exceed ocean acidification, freshwater use, ozone layer, and not included in planetary limits, but confirmed by scientific studies, new entities, pesticide, chemicals, GMOs, plastic, nanomaterial, etc. And this element is important because the legislation is not taking all these issues as seriously as they should be. Atmospheric particles, Earth's habitable space treatment, risk of tipping points. And we know that actually intensive and meat-based agri-food system is a key factor on planetary limits, and especially it represents more than 30% of GHGs. in this context, where in fact there's a lot of representation and a lot of studies done about the necessity to transform our food system, we are facing in Canada, which goes, which permit to have a larger context of the situation. We have a perspective which is endorsed by the Canadian government to reduce agriculture to a growth perspective and to limit regulation to suit agribusiness interest. Former global director of the US consulting firm, McKinsey, which is known quite well also in France and in Britain and everywhere else, which won contracts worth for 84 millions in 2021 and 22 from the Trudeau government. Dominic Barton, which is the former global director of McKinsey, chaired the Ministry of Finance Economic Advisory Council. He focused on growth in the agri-sector, in the agri-food sector, and largely defined Canadian agri-food policy for the coming decades, with the aim of making Canada the world's second largest exporter of agri-food products by 2027, particularly to China, where he was then appointed Canadian ambassador. He also proposed a 50% increase in the number of immigrants admitted to Canada to 100,000 by year. And McKinsey firm received near 25 million from the ministry to devise transformation strategy of this for this ministry. It's important to understand, like it was said in the editorial of Le Devoir, that McKinsey has a reputation for infiltrating the organization he advised, whether governments or private companies, and making itself indispensable. But it's certainly not up to McKinsey to design Canada immigration policy, neither agriculture policy, a policy that should and must be democratically debated, not determined by a private firm. Such dearly found consulting services are no substitute for in-house expertise, nor for the political responsibility of defining the direction of a government and its program, wrote Dutrissac in an editorial in Le Devoir. And yet, this is our agri-food system at a crossroad of health, environment, and democracy has been reduced to a key tool essentially for economic growth, which implies the implementation of a flexible regulatory system that promotes the competitiveness of the agri-food sector and moves at the speed of commerce. For anyone who's following what's going on at the public policy level in agriculture, understand perfectly well the wording of this, the orientation of this sentence. This perspective reinforced the grip of agribusiness at a time when scientific literature underlines the urgent need for much more rigorous assessment and regulatory system, and at a time when international organizations are stressing that the degradation of climate and biodiversity at the crossing of planetary limits call a profound change. I just leave that as an example. I'm sorry. Reform the mandates of the organism, of the regulatory bodies, to include innovation, growth, and competitivity in this sector at the first place. So when you have these kind of orientation, it poses some problems. Despite these orientation, could we make some proposal to try to respond to generic demand? Yes, so we can demand a withdrawal of pesticide linked to Parkinson's disease, to ban endocrine disruptor, carcinogenic, reprotoxic, neurotoxic, and genotoxic, as it is in Europe, not always as effective as we would like to, but it's really more effective than in Canada. Ban the sale and export of highly toxic pesticides. Europe tried to do that. They have done it formerly, but there's still some problem with that. But we have to do it at the international level. Demand the progressive withdrawal of GBH to reduce exposure of individual and the environment, which implies supporting farmers in alternative farming method. Require PMRA to conduct, which is Health Canada, to conduct a rigorous scientific assessment of the full commercial formulation of pesticide and their cumulative and synergetic effect, based on a solid independent literature review. Produce complete longitudinal statistics on pesticides, including products name and characteristic, with mapping by region and crop type, and facilitate free access to them. We have that in France, but we don't have it in Canada, neither in Quebec. And highlight and documents the health impact of GBH in Quebec, including cancer, endocrine disruptor, and reproductive problems, mortality, and associated global cost, and update the SAGE pesticide assessment database, which is very problematic. Develop research programs with France and Europe based on comprehensive integrated approach, linking health, environment, public policy, and economic issues. So it's some proposal which can be applied quite rapidly, but in fact, our major orientation in Canada are not going exactly in this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I would like to open the discussion. There is already a question in the chat. Max Years wrote, I assume it's for you, Professor Van der Lack. Anticipating pushback as formulants can be changed at the whim of the manufacturer. Does this proposal require changing the laws to ensure consistent formulations of the market? And would new formulations leave to start over with the extensive testing? In a few cases, the formulant has been redesigned as a regulated ingredient. Would this be a helpful approach?
I think the presentation of Gilles Seralini and Robin Ménage show pretty well that we have to transform completely the way and the way the assessment is done right now, and we have to analyze the entire product as it is sold. It's clear. It is. Is somebody would like to continue?
Yes, we have. Can I add a
Yes.
word? Yes.
Yes, of course.
We have a real trouble with European deputies to change that, because today in the world, only active principles are at first regulated in the long term because they are tested alone by companies. And if some active ingredients are tested, it is also allowed. So we have proven that there are hidden compounds in the active ingredients within the active ingredients. So we should test the formulations as they will be sold. And this is not reached at a scientific level today. And this is a problem because most of the scientists do believe that the regulation can be improved by little touches. And as it was explained by Louise van der Laak, in fact, the EFSA, which is one of the best in the world today, which is the European body, the European Food Safety Authority, admitted they never requested to companies to test the formulated product, which is the only important thing to know what are the disease in the environment, in general, on the health and at an agricultural or ecosystemic or general level. And so today it's a big and major problem. My question was about, to word paper together, was about rather to know what we can do to improve. For instance, Marie-Hélène was actually pointing the difficulties to have access to the data in Canada, but who decides these difficulties to have access to the data, and can it be requested? The transparency can be requested at the political level. So is there a possibility on that topic? My question is more addressed to Marie-Hélène.
Yeah, so there is a possibility, and actually we do have a good example in Canada with Health Canada regarding pharmaceutical products, and it has been done almost like 10 years ago. There was a trial because Health Canada was withholding data on all the clinical trials of pharmaceutical. So there has been a trial, and eventually Health Canada was forced to publish the result of those clinical trials. And now it is in the law, but only for pharmaceutical products, that Health Canada and the Minister of Health has the power to disclose all CBI information without the consent of the companies. For all the products. Sorry?
What this initiative was due to what body?
It was actually a trial against Health Canada. So that was the issue. So Health Canada was forced to change the law and to include this power and this possibility of disclosing CBI information. So now it's only for pharmaceutical products, but we know that it could be also for pesticides. So it's possible, but it needs political wills, and maybe, you know, we'll also have to sue to get the same result.
Because these patients you were talking about, the Parkinson disease, Louise, do exist. So the organization of patients or other organizations never sued to have access to the data?
No.
It is not known. Why? Is there a legal impossibility, or it is a matter of means? A matter of knowledge?
Yes, for the moment, regarding Parkinson's disease, there's an organization working on this issue, but I think they tried for the moment just to inform the public and to try to construct the organization, but they are not in position right now to ask for that. But I think we will have to do it. That's clear. And surely all the information about health impacts. You know, we have a lot of information from France, even the data which were produced by INSERM, by, you know, many bodies, which permits to have longitudinal data, which are quite interesting. And some problems like Parkinson and LNH, lymphoma, are considered in France since years as problems related to the work in the farms, so related to pesticide, clearly. We have to do that in the first instance in Canada. And when I was looking to the Barton's report, which is really a key to understand the orientation right now in Canada, the only place where it's possible to open the box, it's about health, and about health issue, and about the cost of health issue. And so I think we have to go further in this sense.
Okay, Dr. Ménage, would you have some proposal to go further in a way or another? You talk about the microbiome, but it is not yet, this kind of studies are not in the regulatory obligation for pesticides.
No, the microbiome is one part of the problem. I think it's the designation of an active ingredient as active and the other as inert is
Which is not scientifically
the root of the problem, because then maybe it makes sense for politics and regulation, for economics to classify it as active or inactive, but not for toxicology.
Yeah, so maybe it is not transparently defined at a scientific level either. For instance, I looked at the data on glyphosate that are cited by the industry, and the problem is that it's used at a pharmacological level to show that it is an herbicide, but it's not shown at an agricultural level, 1 to 2%, like it is recommended by the company. And today, even the penetrability of some active ingredients you were talking about, is it always proven? Because in our hands, when we tested on cells glyphosate, radio-labeled glyphosate, it does penetrate with or without formulants in the same manner. So even I don't even trust the data of industry on the so-called some kind of myth about the penetrability. Of course, it could be logical regarding the structure of the things, but as there is a little bit of petroleum mix which is not taken into account, that changes everything. What do you think about that?
No, it is true, and there's some data in the Monsanto paper showing that they could cherry pick which test of permeability they can do, and that's one of the problems with pesticides, is that the tests which are done by industry, they are not mandatory to be registered in advance. So they can do 5 studies and take the ones that they want, because there's no obligation to make public that there is a clinical trial. And if they were doing this, they are doing this for pharmaceuticals, and if this would be mandatory for pesticides, all of the data would be public, and this will clearly change the way they are regulated, because this will not allow this fog that is at the source, because there is clearly an organized confusion between the names of ingredients, an organized confusion whether something is transparent or publicly announced. And this is clearly something which, of course, profits interests, which are economics and politics. But of course, in this case, if there is a health effect, it's discovered often 10 and 20 years after. And of course, this was not considered at first.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you know what is preoccupying for me is that today even lessons in toxicology, in pharmacology, and what is taught and what is believed and what is written in the textbooks is not based on, first of all of these data, but on the complete and the transparent data. And so they can recreate scientific, so-called not transparent set of data. And this is a problem because it hurts not only health, it hurts ecosystem, but it hurts also science. So what is taught in toxicology, and that concerns very much toxics, and the focus it has can be in part wrong. For instance, I reviewed a lot of papers that were talking about pesticides, only talking about the active ingredient. And so today we must know that the ADI and other parts are insufficient to assess everything, including the impact on the endocrine, but also the nervous system, because we have shown on other paper the link between both. So we are at kind of pre-story of the thing, of all that, and that should be taken into account in the future. But we see the room for improvement, but not all the scientific community knows it. So as they take what is not what is transparent, which is very little.
I would like to also step in. There are a few questions in the chat. First, I will answer the technical one from Andre Kamel. Yes, there will be a video recording available, and it will be shared with you at the end of towards the end of the webinar. And there is a follow-up question for Max Sears. In the context of biodiversity commitments at the COP15 to halve the pesticides used by 2030, what degree of support should go to the organic farming that is harmed by pesticide drift and other routes of contamination? Please comment on the issue of the right to save seeds in the context of pesticides as well as genetically modified seeds. Canada has just chosen to allow gene-edited seeds on the market without no regulation or formal registration.
Mhm.
So please,
That's
Yeah.
another problem.
Thank you.
We need, however, the transparency on what are the gene-edited seeds are made for. And this is not obvious. When we want to get this transparency, we don't have it. But mostly they are done to be tolerant to pesticide or to make their own insecticide.
I just would like to add a little comment about the Meg's here comment. That's a fact that in Canada right now, we are going very, very fast to what we call Ag 4.0, which is the introduction of all the of genetically modified seeds, of drones and artificial intelligence and many, many tools to transform agriculture. And all that is planned since about 10 years now. So, and we are going there very, very fast. And it means that all the questions that we will have to face are more and more complex and more difficult. So even if it's a seminar on toxicology, I think we really need to have interdisciplinary work, because all these questions are so complex that we really need to have different perspective on this issue. Thank you.
Okay. Somebody would like to answer to Andre Como questions? That was
It was responded by Peter Rebar.
Thank you for the answer. There is another question from Max Sears. Canada has never measured glyphosate in Canadians, and the US only recently released data on glyphosate in Americans. We are flying blind on exposure, much less effects. Should pesticide regulation have an associated requirement for environmental and human biomonitoring?
Yeah.
Good idea.
Of course. Of course,
Okay.
this could be taken into account. However, it should be before the authorization. Of course, we cannot measure yet a pesticide which has not been released in the environment. And the only thing that can be done is on rats at the first beginning, because we don't study normally on humans or farmers pesticides before they are authorized. And this is a problem because we cannot even have the transparency on the toxicological data on rats, except all the work we have done.
But we can add that the best data about health problems are related to retrospective study of groups of workers in the field. And these studies show that more than 46% have cancer. So it's a study which was done by Zhang, and it's quite interesting to see how much these long-term study can be powerful. Because, because in this case, yes, because in this case, it's clearly glyphosate. It's clearly Roundup and not only glyphosate, which is studied.
Of course, the petroleum residues that we have evidenced, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are clearly for the authorities themselves carcinogenic at the level where we found those in the pesticides. So, you know, it's a little bit contradictory, even that as scientists, we have left the authorities do with undeclared compounds. So we could also work on that in order to oblige to have an authorization to oblige to have all the compounds. Today we are fighting, and a few days ago, Arista, who is from Ken China, a company associated with Syngenta in Europe, fighted the European Food Safety Authority to avoid to give the formulants that we requested. And so that really means that the companies are the bodies that prevent this action. So we should let that know better to the public.
There is also an observation or a comment from Laura Bowman. She's saying that in Canada, there is a requirement to report any study sponsored by the registrant that shows adverse effects. However, it's not enforced. And she also shared a link. And there is also a question from Richard van der Jaagt. What do you think of correlating exposures to pesticides, blood levels, and adverse health outcomes on the population basis in multiple jurisdictions?
That's for Canada more?
Yes, well, I think it would be a good idea, because what we've seen, for instance, in Montérégie, which is an important agricultural region in Quebec, is that we have, for instance, much higher levels of non-Hodgkin lymphoma than in the rest of Canada. And as you've seen from the data that Louise has shown, Quebec is much more exposed to glyphosate-based herbicides. And so we do have, it could be a good idea, you know, to make that kind of correlation, to start to investigate, to have epidemiological studies, to make links. So if we have data on which pesticides are used where, and we make correlation with what we've seen in terms of health impact, it could be a good way to, to show that there are impacts.
Well, the American patients that have non-Hodgkin lymphoma have been grouped. So nothing in Canada that was tried because it's close and they have looked at what happened in California. So why there was not, there was no lawyer or no groupman, because in Canada, you can make an advertisement to recruit people or patients.
Yes, there's some case, but it's an individual case essentially, and it's all over Canada. So it's.
Do you know what prevents the difference? What do you know why there is the fundamental reason for the difference?
Maybe you can explain it to me.
No, it must have to do something with the patients or something with the low level, or I don't know.
Frankly, for me, it's a paradox. I've told to the direction of PMRA in a meeting that we had that it was quite incredible that nobody was speaking about all the trials in the United States where more than 100,025 people were suing Bayer Monsanto. And nobody was speaking about that in Canada. And at PMRA,
Not even the newspapers?
oh, very, very little. And at PMRA, they just turned their head saying, oh, it's a good question. And just to avoid to discuss about that. So yes, it's two countries which are quite near one from the other one, but the orientation right now is to be the second food producer in the world after the United States. So to have the same kind of industrial agriculture, and the example which are given also, it's
I understand the political constraints or let's say knowledge, but I cannot understand that the people and the patients are not aware of what happened in other countries today.
That's a good question, but I don't have a real response.
Maybe we can also look at a social level why people are not reacting the same. I'm really amazed by the fact that there was 100,000 patients and 10 billions in the States and that nothing happened. It's not just because I know them very well. It's not because of the courage of Boumediene cabinet. It's also because, because there is a group of lawyers or something.
There is a raised hand from Lara Bowman. I would like to allow her to speak if you allow me. Lara, please go ahead.
Sorry.
Hi. Thanks for letting me jump in. So in Canada, one of the challenges is that we have much weaker class action laws than the United States. We have lower damage awards. It's hard for a class action to get certified. So there's a number of class action firms here that are working on trying to develop pesticide class actions, but none have been certified yet by the court. And that's the big hurdle so far. So right now there is
why they have not been certified?
Well, we have a really difficult certification test that has been applied really ungenerously by a bunch of the courts. So in Quebec, it's easier to get a class action certified than elsewhere in Canada. So yeah, it's basically we need class actions reform here to kind of get those kind of cases off the ground. But a bunch of firms are giving it a shot under the current regime, and we'll see what happens.
We should look at why this happened. What prevents at a low level that? For instance, we worked also on what prevents the fact that there is a big money in the States possible and not in Europe, for instance. So for €1, you won't go to an organism, but for €10,000, you begin to go. And this is due to the difference at a legal level. So there is also a financial aspect from that.
I would like to add that at Justice Pesticide, which is an international organization about all the trials and all the legal intervention which are done right now about pesticides, there are more than 500 cases on this website. So everybody can go to the website of Justice Pesticide and it can permit to follow all the cases which are in court or which
this gives the results, but it doesn't explain why. Judge, it's probably due to a difference in the information of the judges, so of lack of transparency. It's linked. Okay.
There's a comment of André Comeau, maybe for Robert, who works on microbiome. Maybe you can take a look and try to respond.
Yes, if you can share it orally, so we know.
Oh, but Robert could go on Q&R.
Yes, I'm just going through. I didn't know that it was there because it was not on. So I will read it out loud. I suspected for over 10 years that pesticide disrupted the microbiome. My contribution is that I found data about Clostridium difficile over case. And yeah, this is about the declaration of herbicide ingredients as antibiotics. And it's clear that for glyphosate, this is a debate because I think this is also one type of label designation, antibiotic or not, which can be also relative because it's mostly about declaration in this case. And glyphosate has not been declared as an antibiotic. It was patented and clearly it has some effects on bacteria. So it's I agree that it's a gap, and we need to also understand that. But just what I wanted to add also, since I'm talking, is that in this scientific literature, there is really this confusion because herbicides are not fully declared. We don't know where they are from. And I'm taking the opportunity to address MDPI now, because if the journals were doing their job at assessing the papers just for basic information before sending to peer review, that could be avoided, because it's easy to see if for a toxicology paper, what has been tested is it is described with country reference and when it was bought, and there should be a minimum level of information, and this should not be fully the responsibility of scientists, but the journals also have a responsibility in this case. So I would be really curious to know
but the journals are run by scientists.
What they could do, or if they have something planned for that.
Yeah. So today we have to work. Maybe we could list we could give examples of the cases that have improved the situation to explain transparency, or if you have better ideas. We are close to finish this webinar, and we could make a paper together with all the other scientists that didn't talk and that are there, if they want, to explain how to improve the regulation, what's wrong, and how to improve the regulation. Because I see a big problem with the scientific community that doesn't know what it is what the community is really assessing today. And so it is one of the problems.
Yeah. I just would like to respond very quickly on Matthias' auto question, saying that there's a lot of problem at the level of environment and not only health. That's clear. But one of the problems that we face in Canada, the regulation of pesticide, which was 25 years ago, to the agriculture ministry, is now with PMRA at Health Canada, and the modification of the comment s'appelle Marie-Hélène, j'ai besoin de toi.
It was the Environmental Act.
That's
right?
it.
Yeah.
The Environmental Act, it's in discussion right now. It will be adopted quite soon, and we will have it for the next 25 years. And I found quite interesting that pesticides are not in this law. So it's related to environment, but we don't have all the tools which are important to get that. And so it's still a problem at the level of public policy here.
So I see a role for toxics, to finish my part and my conclusion, which is to coordinate a review about what's wrong in toxicology today and how to improve transparency. We could go further to have a manuscript that would finish this issue about how to improve toxicology of tomorrow, and transparency should be one goal. But everyone who has listened about this webinar and who wants to join is welcome to write to Toxics to put questions or to say what part he would like to see.
And if I can just add a word, we had a colloquium at ACFAS last week, and we will publish a special issue of Vertigo on pesticide at the end of the year. So everybody can understand the importance of all these issues for all of us.
So, Peter Riba, would you like to add and close the webinar?
I would like to just ask if there are any closing remarks which you like to give, and if no, then of course I would like to thank all the panelists that they took the time and for very nice presentation and very fruitful discussions. And I would like to also thank to all the attendees, and yeah, just enjoy the day.
Yes, my closing remarks are that we would like to make a review altogether on the way to improve the situation, because we have explained all the problems, and today we want to increase the transparency, at least at a scientific level first, and to have tools or tricks that could be used, well, even with concrete examples, that would be good. So don't hesitate to write to Toxics or to this webinar coordination.
Thank you very much, Professor Selenini. One more time, thank you all the panelists, thank you all the attendees for your time, and I wish you a lovely day.